Forested area of the United States. In discussing the amount of forest land we have in the United States, it's important to understand that the United States is rich in natural resources, with forests being quite abundant. So how much forest land is there in the United States? Well, let's look at it from the perspective of 5 different regions. First, we'll look at the eastern part of the United States. That can be divided into 2 regions, north and south. And then we'll divide the western region into the Rocky Mountains, Alaska, and Pacific coast. As you can see, the southern forest, and looking back to the 1630s, there was over 1 billion acres in forest land, with approximately 350 million acres in our southern forests, which are dominated by species such as loblolly pine, longleaf pine, and many different types of hardwoods, ranging from our bottomland hardwoods to upland oaks. The northern region of the United States back in the 1630s, about 300 million acres of forest land. It was dominated by the hardwoods that we know of, such as northern red oak, white oak, hickory, or hard maples such as sugar maple. And there's many industries that were built around these type of species. As we look to the west, the Rocky Mountain region in the 1630s was about 150 million acres of forested land, and this was species such as ponderosa pine and lodgepole pine. As we moved up into places like Alaska, which was just about 125 million acres in the 1630s, it was dominated by species such as Sitka spruce, aspen, alder, and other types of species. And then as we look at the Pacific coast, about 100 million acres of forested land. Again, this was species such as Doug fir and many different types of hardwoods. As time went by, land was, really from about 1630 to the 1850s, that 1 billion acres of forest land really saw little change in the total amount of forested land across the United States. But as we began to settle and we moved into the 1800s, as European settlement really began to expand, and the federal government was pushing hard to get rid of public domain land and give it to private sector, what we saw was that we almost had a loss of approximately 1/3 of our forested land as we began to settle really the eastern half of the United States. The majority of this loss occurred in the eastern half because the land was being cleared for settlement and cleared for agriculture. It is estimated that we were clearing land on an average at a rate of 13 square miles a day for 50 years. For the past 100 years, the total forested area, though, has been relatively stable, even though our U.S. population has more than tripled. And by the beginning of the 21st century, we see that forest cover approximately is 751 million acres. And really, as you can see, because of the loss of forested land to things such as agriculture and the settlement of the eastern part of the United States, our land has land cover here in the eastern U.S. that was forested has significantly changed, where that in the western part of the United States has seen relatively little change since the 1630s. Now, the reason for this is that as we were settling to the west, as we were moving to the west, and got into the early 1900s and everything, started to realize that the amount of forest land loss was significant, and people were starting to concern about loss of timber resource that was fueling the economy at that time. Conservationists such as Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir stepped up and pushed on our federal government to create policies to protect our lands in the West. That's where we came up with the creation of the U.S. Forest Service and our forest lands that are owned by the federal government there, as well as our national park system, in which John Muir was a significant player in the creation of our national parks. So the federal policies that were created at that time really shaped forest land cover across the United States and really protected a lot of the land in the West. And as policies are developed and put in place that impact landowners and forest land, how the landowners are impacted in the East are often significantly different than how the forested land in the West is impacted. And that's because if you look at land ownership, only about 37% of the United States forest land is under public ownership, and that is really dominated almost as much as 70% in the western part of the United States, where private ownership, forest land is at about 63% of private ownership. And as you can see from this map of the United States, as you can see, the western part is really dominated by federal, state, and not so much local ownership, but really by federal and state ownerships. And here in the eastern part of the United States, we see a lot of the private ownership